Okay, so we got the recording going, and in this recording, what I'd like to talk about is this concept of importing and exporting. And so, just go kind of start the conversation with this. JavaScript's been around for a long time, and it started some major changes around 2015. In 2015, which might seem like a long time ago, 7 years ago, some of you might have been in grade school, right? But in terms of, how fast everything moves, these changes are relatively new. And so what happened in 2015 is they made a version of what they call ECMAScript. Now, ECMAScript is the standard that JavaScript is based on. So you might have heard this, or ECMA script, right? But in short, they call it ES, ECMAScript, ES, version 6. And this ES6 came out in 15, and then every year they release a new version. 6, 7, so on and so forth. Kind of the reason I bring this in, ECMAScript, ECMA script. When you go to versions, you can kind of see in the Wikipedia, again, this is kind of like equivalent of saying the JavaScript version, like JavaScript version 5, JavaScript version 6. It's kind of the same thing. So when we say, ECMAScript 6 was a big one, it's kind of like saying the 6th edition of JavaScript. And the reason that was a big one is because in 2015 they started saying, we're going to start releasing features yearly. So just looking at this, you can see every year they're putting out new JavaScript features, right? And so that's kind of what we're starting to look at when we're looking at things like import and export. Like, these features haven't been around that long, like in the grand scope of things. It might seem like a long time, and I don't exactly know what version importing and exporting came into play, but the point is it's a relatively new feature. So, frankly, it's newer. Okay, so that's what I'm getting at. And so what is this? The idea is it's kind of surprising that this hasn't been in JavaScript for a longer time. The idea is pretty simple, is that you can kind of share code between files. Like if you have a variable, you might want to, share that variable, or share, maybe even more commonly, like sharing methods between JavaScript files. So you have different scripts, and this is a very explicit way of sharing your data between your source code files and sharing your methods between your source code files. The benefit of that, like the benefit of having small source code files, is having small chunks of reusable code, right? And so, in my mind at least, it's kind of surprising in a way that sharing code between files, explicitly sharing code between files, is a relatively new feature of JavaScript. So this hasn't really been around the way that we're going to do this for some time. So that's kind of the precursor to this. Now, so we understand what we're doing is we're splitting our code across multiple JavaScript files. When you have a file, I guess the first thing is there's a term that you might a term that you'll want to get familiar with. A JavaScript file is AKA, also known as a module. And so, that's when you hear a module, right? That's just some language for saying a JavaScript file. And again, the benefit of this is kind of smaller files to keep each module, to keep each file kind of focused in what it does. And also manageable, right? The larger the file becomes, the less manageable it becomes, because it starts to do a lot of different things, and those different things can cause different bugs, harder to manage a bunch of bugs. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to be able to export functionality. When I say export functionality, you're talking about exporting a function. Right, so maybe we want to export a function from one file and import it into another file. Right, so we can kind of start there, where we'll write a function in one file, we'll export it, and then we'll import that function into another file. And so let's go ahead and just make a function, and let's export it. So we talked about the various ways to do a function. I'll use an arrow function, constant double equals. We're going to take a input parameter of number, arrow, num times 2. And I'm going to export. There's a couple of ways of doing this. When you're exporting, there's two types of exports. Type 1 is known as a default export, aka also known as an unnamed export. The other one would be a named export. Okay, so we have two types of exports. We have default, and then we have a named export. So let's look at the default. Export default double. And okay, so this is my linter barking at me, saying that we need this module, we need this script to have a certain label, which is just like a modern JavaScript module. Let me pause real quick. I'm going to look up something. Okay, I'm just going to proceed. I think I would have to change some settings in my linter to not worry about that. I'm just going to proceed, and I don't think that's going to cause me any errors. Okay, so we have a default, aka an unnamed export. We have a method in here, and what we want to do is just bring this method into another script file. And so let's go ahead and create another script file. And to import this method now, so I'm going to use strict. And import. And what comes after the import is the name of the function in this file. Now over here we called it double. Okay, so it kind of makes sense to say import double from dot slash that's current directory script dot JS. Okay, so it says double is declared but never used. Now what I'm going to do is wire up my event handler over here. Okay, I'm going to take the event handler out of this method. out of this file. Okay, so we don't have like any conflicts. I'm going to link up both script. I don't really need a link to script 1 at this point. I really just need a link to script 2. Okay, now script 2 will get a method from script 1. And what I want to do is I want to use it. So I'll say console.log. I'll just start by saying, hi mom. Let's just verify that my button click will give me a hi mom before we do the cannot use import outside of module. I'm probably gonna have to fix that, huh? Yeah, let me pause. I'm gonna have to fix that. Okay, yep. And this is what was missing. So now I had to add a type of module. And let's look. MDN type module. JavaScript modules. Okay, there's an MDN article on it. Background, browser compatibility, module features. Okay, so in order to do these imports and exports, we're going to have to add this type of module. And that's just a requirement. So now we're up and working. Let's pull up, and really this is no longer anything to do with ternary operator. I'm just going to have a button click that says demo, and this is a import export demo. Okay, so we kind of pull this up right now, and we've got hi mom, and so let us now console.log double value of 5, which should return what I do. 5 times 2 is 10. Okay, so this should return 10, and console 5 times 2 is 10. Okay, so we have made a function, we've exported it and imported it into another file. Cool. So a little bit more to it. Of course, we can export other things besides functions, but let's just kind of keep it there for now. We can export variables, we can export objects, arrays, etc., etc. Let's do the other kind of. Now, one thing that's kind of unique here, when we have a default export, and then we bring this in as double, import double from script.js. Oddly enough, this name right here is a name of your choice, right? So even though it's called double in the source code, we can name it differently when you have a when you're importing a default export, right? So that's still working, right? We called it double, but when it was a default export, it doesn't work in the other case. So let's export a named export. So if you get rid of the keyword double, the default, so we're going to do export double. So when we have a named export, they have to be imported by their name. And so when we're exporting one thing, I don't think we need to wrap this in an object. Now we're going to import the same name, import double, and then this has to be double. So we just got rid of the default keyword, and that changed it from a default export to a named export. So let's export double, and then we import double, call double. Okay, my syntax is off. Unexpected token export. So you want to export it as such. So when you have named exports, you put them in curlies, and then the same thing when you import. And there you go. So when you have a named export, you do have to wrap the curly braces. It's also worth saying, hey, I have multiple methods, right? So let's const triple equals num return num times 3. So if I want to export triple, we say double comma triple, and then we can do double comma triple. So now we have multiple, and console.log triple 5. Okay, so those are defaults versus named importing and exporting. There's also a piece of this where you start having a bunch of exports, and instead of bringing them all in, as we've done, so here's the exports, here's the imports like this, you can import star as, we would just call these, import star as my methods, and then you could say my methods dot double and my methods dot triple. And so you can use this star as a wildcard and bring in essentially an object, right? And that object has these methods double and triple. You can also export data. So maybe we have an array. I'll just bring this in. Const user ages equals, we'll just say 5, 10, 15. So here's some data inside of an array. I'll say comma user ages. So just like you can export methods, you can export some data. So this is an array. And over here, we can say for each. So here's an example of the for each. The array is what? Well, arrays in my methods, which is no longer a good name, by the way, my methods dot user ages for each age console dot log age. So here's a for each loop we briefly touched on yesterday that loops through an array. That array is this user ages array that's being imported. Again, I called it my methods. Not a good name anymore, but now you can see I'm exporting an array and looping through that array on the console. Okay, so that's importing and exporting. And, you know, kind of a takeaway from this, you know, there's a couple of ways to export with named and defaults. When you have default exports, you have a little bit of flexibility of how you bring in that data as far as the name. When you have named exports like this, you don't have the keyword default. You have to bring them in under that name, under that exact name. So you don't have that flexibility when you have named exports. And then something that, again, I haven't done this in vanilla JavaScript a ton. I've used these imports and exports in React, but haven't done it in vanilla JavaScript a ton. So just another kind of learning step for me was not to forget this type of module on our script attribute tag, on our script tag attribute, I should say. All right.